This is your Chargers linebacker, Dan Henley, and you're tuning in with Chargers Unleashed.
Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. This is your first time tuning in to the show. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, pivotal Week 3 matchup as the undefeated Chargers at 2-0 face the undefeated Steelers, also at 2-0. Two of 9 teams that are currently undefeated in the NFL right now. Chargers traveling to Pittsburgh. They stayed on the East Coast after a win last week in Carolina. But Dan, getting to 3-0 is a big task, something that the Chargers have not done in 22 years. Big-time litmus test as it relates to this Chargers offense going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, which statistically ranks just behind the Chargers defense as it relates in a numerical number of categories. But we are going to break down everything as it relates to these big-time matchups, Chargers offense versus the Steelers defense, and the opposite, Steelers offense versus the Chargers defense. Lots to get into, lots to break down as we look forward to Sunday morning. But as you can see, if you were watching on YouTube, Dan and I are once again in remote locations. Mine is kind of by necessity because of some unfortunate water damage that took place in my house. Dan, on the meantime, is on vacation, and he has been kind enough to take time out of his day for coming on board for Chargers Unleashed and previewing this pivotal matchup. Dan Wolkenstein, how are you, sir?
I'm good. The people are worth it. And you said it, 3-0 is going to be tough. Getting to this episode was tough for us, considering all the dynamics that have been at play with us both being remote. But this is a fun matchup, and one that we are not used to talking in this manner. When Chargers go up against the Steelers in years past, in games past, it has been, can the Chargers withstand the body punches of the Steelers, and can they finesse their way into a victory? No more. That is not this Chargers team, and they are looking at men in the mirror, so to speak, which we'll talk about. So many similarities of these two teams at this point, but also some stark differences. So we'll get into all of those. So key storylines, obviously. Again, apologies for audio or visual issues that we're having. If the hotel Wi-Fi goes out, not my fault, I promise. If Jake's water damage continues to leak out into other areas of this episode.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm not in the house where the water damage is.
Okay, fair.
So
fair.
If something else goes wrong, just chalk it up to that's just Jake's shitty luck and basically the summation of this entire episode.
Yes, and if you see a baby running around, that's mine. My bad. There's only so many square feet in this hotel room. But, Jake, before we get to all of the Steelers, Chargers preview stuff, let's pay the bills. Let's talk about our friends over at Bet Online.
Want to remind everybody that Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything that's football. Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during the games. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our 200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of $200K. When the game is over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of our 150 slot games. Head on over to the website today. That's betonline.ag to get in on the action. Bet Online, the game starts here.
So, Jake, we've known for a long time the Steelers defense is coming to play. They always do.
Yes.
No difference this year as well. Difference is, though, this Chargers team now has a defense and a running game that can possibly turn the tide here, as well as a number 5 overall pick who has a huge test ahead. Already has gone up against Jadeveon Clowney. Already has gone up against Max Crosby. Now goes up against TJ Watt. Joe Alt has a test ahead. Cam Hayward is there as well. The Steelers defensive front is going to be tough. How do you see Joe Alt? I mean, we'll get into the key storylines, but I think Joe Alt is a part of maybe the biggest storyline of this. If you look at the macro view here, Jake, what do you think is kind of like the biggest thing you're looking for?
Yeah, this is the spotlight on Joe Alt because obviously there's been so much praise on his play through the first 2 weeks of the season. And now you're going up against the guy in TJ Watt who has the most sacks against any rookie offensive lineman that he has played against since he has been in the NFL. So it's a stat to remember. big time litmus test for Joe Alt coming into this matchup. We know what kind of havoc that TJ Watt can, the attention that he demands on defense is extremely high. You couple that in with Cam Hayward, who still is just an aging wonder for Pittsburgh, can still be a disruptor. You have Alex Highsmith on the other side, who's probably going to be matched up with Rashawn Slater for a majority of this matchup. The interior of Pittsburgh's defense, I think, is going to try to dictate this matchup much in the similar type of way that the Raiders defense was going after the interior of the Chargers offensive line. But yeah, Dan, you look at that matchup with Joe Alt and TJ Watt on the outside, there's no question that this is just going to be a game of the trenches again. Who's going to win out the most? And you look at the Pittsburgh defense, and they're fourth in the league in terms of a number of different stats, but number 4 overall in terms of points allowed. They're just behind the Chargers. The Chargers have allowed 13 points through the first 2 weeks. The Pittsburgh Steelers have allowed 16. This could be like an old school style of Baltimore Ravens versus Pittsburgh Steelers type games. I probably wouldn't expect that it's going to be like a 9-3, not that old school, but in terms of what we've seen from the Chargers historically offensively and what this Pittsburgh defense is bringing to the table, it's so similar. It really is in terms of both offensively and defensively, in terms of what they want to do, how they want to dictate the pace, how they want to run their style of offense and defensive matchups. And it starts up front, Dan. So how is Joe Alt going to be able to handle the pass rush? It's going to be a tall task, no question about it.
Yeah, no pun intended, no tall task. He is 6'8", so I think he should be able to at least be up for the challenge if you continue that. I mean, this is going to be such an interesting and palm sweating experience for Chargers and Steelers fans for 60 minutes, because this whole thing is going to be intense. And the part that I think is fun for Chargers fans and interesting to look at in this matchup is, we mentioned at the top, but this Chargers team now has a defense. They have the 6th best rushing defense, currently 80 yards per game, 9th best in yards per carry, allowed just 4.0. They're one of 11 teams in the NFL to not give up a 40-yard pass yet, which we've seen years past. That is a stat that does not ever bode well for the Chargers.
Before week 3 in the previous years, that number would have easily been in double digits.
Yep. Yeah. And we mentioned that the defense is something we haven't seen. And then the running game is something we haven't seen. The offense, 2nd best rushing team in the NFL going into week 3, 395 yards rushing by this Chargers team, as well as 4th best yards per carry at 5.6. Shout out J.K. Dobbins, who has been absolutely remarkable. Not used to seeing that. We're also not used to seeing an offense that's 28th in passing behind Justin Herbert. And we've talked about some of the things that are at play, reasons for that. I don't necessarily know if this is a game in which that changes, if I'm being frank. I think this is one of those games where win by any means necessary. And if they're trying to throw it all over the yard, go for it. Don't do it week 3. That just seems like a recipe for disaster. So, Jake, I think, would you rather start with Chargers offense versus Steelers defense, or other way around?
Yeah, Dan, let's start there, because I think that this is where, you mentioned how the Chargers now having a defense. I think that there is a lot of confidence that's actually being put into the Chargers defense, considering how it's played over the last 2 weeks, maybe more so considering that the Chargers defense has been absent virtually for the last 3.5 years. And to see it have this type of turnaround, even though in a small sample size, it's been very impressive. So yeah, let's start on the Chargers offense versus the Steelers defense, because I think that that's where more of the question marks lie.
So, in my opinion, and Jake, you tell me if you think this is the case as well, but you've heard Greg Roman, and you also heard folks, within the coaching staff talk about, them needing to be physical and dominating the trenches. And Greg Roman talks about that medieval type of play. This is the type of game, in my opinion, that is built for. And so, Chargers offense, Steelers defense, this is seemingly if there was a Jim Harbaugh type game, if we haven't seen it already, this is it. This is a game in which I think the Chargers, I can see them running it 50 times. and I can see them punting if they need to. This could very well be a low-scoring game-ish, but this is going to be all about protecting the crown jewel of Justin Herbert, blocking for the running game. My daughter's trying to give me a vitamin. And hopefully, this Chargers team can impose their will and they can throw those body punches. This is going to be a big test. This is going to be a blocking test, in my opinion. Obviously, the tackles, the interior offensive line is going to be tested huge this week, similar to what we saw week 1. And then we're also going to see, in my opinion, this is where you're going to have the edges of the offensive line, both tackles as well as running backs. Can they actually block for the running backs? Can they pass protect as well? And will they make this into a game in which it's a clean relative jersey for Justin Herbert?
Yeah, Dan, I think you're spot on that in terms of the goals of what the Chargers want to execute offensively. After week 1, while it was good performances by both Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt, it was the interior of the offensive line that was the weak point during that game. We talked about it leading up to the game against Carolina that we felt that this could be a get-right game for them, correct some of those mistakes that they had. And obviously you saw that in the run game. You saw that in the pass protection. The interior of that offensive line, and with Zion Johnson, Bradley Bozeman, and Trey Pipkins performed much better in week 2. You're going to have a very, very tough challenge going up against this Steelers defensive front in week 3. Now, to your point, Dan, if there's some silver lining to be had, obviously, the medieval game plan, yes, that's going to be forefront, what the Chargers want to execute. That's going to dictate the pace for what they are able to do with Justin Herbert and the receivers and make their game plan more multiple and less predictable. Historically, the last 3 times that J.K. Dobbins has faced the Steelers defense, he's averaged 108 yards rushing. Historically, Greg Roman, going all the way back to his time in Baltimore and going up against the Steelers defense, his game plan in terms of executing the run fared pretty good. So I would assume that they're going to have that same type of mindset for what they want to do. Again, it's not going to be easy to accomplish, but Dan, this would be a huge barrier to overcome if the Chargers are actually able to win this type of trench game against the talent that the Steelers defense has along that defensive line. If they are able to assert their will, if they are able to get physical and start dominating that line of scrimmage, this is going to be a very interesting game just in terms of how the Chargers are going to be able to move the football.
And we had, and I forget, when we did the record predictions early on, I believe I had the Chargers starting 2-1. I think you had them 3-0. So you have, well, that might be a preview of what's to come. That might change now that we're 2 weeks into the 3rd week. This is the game. I think this is the first game that the Chargers faced that going into the season we thought, yeah, they could lose this one. And for good reason. Luckily for the Chargers, which we'll get to the other side of the ball here, the quarterback situation for the Steelers really hasn't gotten much better since last year. Marginally, maybe. You know, Russell Wilson is still not throwing, which even if he was, I'm not sure how much better that would be. So clearly you have a scrambling quarterback in Justin Fields that you have to work on stopping, but you also have Deion Henley, who has had a very, very good start to his season. But the running game, I think, is something that is important. And I'm curious, we have a giveaway of Chargers Unleashed. Hopefully, we see J.K. Dobbins continue his trajectory. If you go to Chargers Unleashed Twitter profile, LAC_Unleashed, all you got to do is follow and retweet. If J.K. Dobbins gets over 100 yards rushing this week, we'll give away a J.K. Dobbins jersey. I hope to see it continue. This could be a J.K. Dobbins performance again. It could also be one in which Gus Edwards comes to form. And Greg Roman talked about how invaluable Gus Edwards is. Even if the stats don't really bear it, the physicality and the nature in which he punishes defensive linemen or linebackers over and over and over again is some of the benefit that J.K. Dobbins has been able to get. And this could be a game where Gus Edwards earns his money. And so would I love to see J.K. Dobbins continue his remarkable start to the season?
Who would?
Of course. Would I be surprised if it is a little bit more balanced in terms of production? Not at all. A side stat, which I find fascinating for J.K. Dobbins, Jake, according to Next Gen Stats, I posted this on Twitter, but I wanted folks to hear this as well. Remarkable rushes, quote unquote, which they deem as yards over expected. So how many yards do they get over what they thought would be a stop? J.K. Dobbins has 3 of the top 6 remarkable rushes in the entire NFL. Like, first, that by itself is crazy. Second, the fact that it's a Charger running back that has that blows my mind. The 3 rushes they have, 2 in week 1, 1 in week 2, combined for 136 yards over what was expected to be, which talks to J.K. Dobbins' ability to turn something into something much better. And so, can the Chargers offense do that? Can they take what the Steelers defense is giving them and impose their will a couple more yards, a couple more first downs, a couple more series? To me, that's what this game is going to be about. Can they extend drives, get points on the board? I don't know if it's going to be touchdowns that are required all the time. Sure, it would be nice. But what we've seen so far through 2 weeks is this Chargers defense can hang. And they don't necessarily need you to score 7 points every time. They'll take 3. They'll even take a punt every now and then. They'll get you the ball back. So efficiency, ball protection, getting the ball into scoring territory by any means necessary. That's the key for me. Clean game as much as you can be. Let the defense do the rest.
In the times, Dan, where they're not going to be able to run the ball, obviously you still have to utilize Justin Herbert at some point during this game and these wide receivers at some point during this game. This is still an impressive Steelers secondary. You know, you have the likes of Minkah Fitzpatrick, Corey Trice, safety Deshaun Elliott back there. All 3 of them have played admirably well through the first 2 weeks of the season. Where I think in terms of Chargers weapons that you can attack this defense is going to be in the middle of the field. So whether we're talking about getting Quentin Johnson out into space with some crossing routes, whether you're going to be able to use Ladd McConkey in some of those short yarded situations, much like you did in Carolina, to move the sticks in that circumstance. I would love to see more usage out of Hayden Hurst and Will Dissly in this game. You saw a little bit of it with Will Dissly and against the Carolina Panthers. But seemingly for as many tight ends as you're going to have on the field in terms of running the ball, I would like to see them be utilized a little bit more in the passing game as well, just in terms of those short yarded situations to keep the drives going. But Dan, in terms of the middle of the field, I think that this is where this Chargers offense can look to exploit the Steelers defensively.
Gotta love when you're on mute.
I love it.
It's going to be tough. It all depends on if they can protect for Justin Herbert. And we've seen Justin Herbert dealing with an ankle injury, heavily wrapped, was limited in practice as of yesterday. I think he plays. I don't foresee a way in which he doesn't play. I also don't foresee a way that they risk anything too crazy. And so while I would love to see Justin sling it, I just don't see that being this game. And I think we have a smart enough coaching staff and a collective brain trust to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of this team. So I'm hoping that they play it smart, and I expect that they will. And I think that kind of, as we get to the other side of the ball, Jake, these 2 coaching staffs, especially the head coaches, look at the defensive side of the ball. You look at the way that the style in which they play. Like, it is very much a mirror of each other. And you see the way Mike Tomlin wins by any means necessary.
Doesn't matter.
Past. Jim Harbaugh is the same way. And it doesn't matter the gaudy stats. No one cares, at least in these locker rooms. And so when you flip to the other side of the ball, that's why you have these 2 dominant defenses right now. And it's so crazy to think that the Chargers have a dominant defense. Like, just saying those words still doesn't feel real. But it's the real deal. Jesse Minter is the truth. Talked about it for months now. Going to the other side, Jake, looking at the Chargers defense against this Steelers offense, to me, the entire game comes down to containment. if they can contain Justin Fields and contain the running game, if they don't allow explosive plays, I think this game's won. I think the game's won. That's the part that I'm nervous about.
Historically, the Chargers have been terrible against quarterbacks that are mobile. This is really the first true test that Jesse Minter gets to go up against a quarterback like this. Say what you want against for Justin Fields for the first 2 weeks of the season. Steelers won week 1 against Atlanta by kicking 6 field goals. It did not matter to Mike Tomlin how they won that game. They are the third team since 1960 that has started off a season 2-0 by only scoring 1 touchdown through 2 weeks, which is just ridiculous. The other 2 teams was the 88 Bills and the 2000 Detroit Lions. That's a short list for teams that have done what they've done. But at the end of the day, as you said, Mike Tomlin does not give a shit, because at the end of the day, if it means the difference between making the playoffs and missing them, who's going to care how you won the game at the end of the day? So, yes, everything stays with containment. Dan, I think this is going to have to be a similar type of aspect to what the game plan was against the Carolina Panthers and Bryce Young. If you can take away this running game of Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, and at least limit it, and forcing Justin Fields into situations where he has to throw, I think that's where you can get this defense off to a good start. Putting them in 3rd and long situations and forcing Justin Field to make decisions, this is where this defense can start to tee off and play its brand of Jesse Minter football. It's still not going to be easy to do so.
No.
Regardless of what you think about the quarterback, this is still not going to be an easy task for them to do.
Well, as much as, and this is the thing, as much as you and I, and maybe folks listening, watching, see these as keys, you don't think the Steelers see this coming either? Like, it's clear. That's where this is like a battle of imposed will. Both sides probably know what they're going to do most times. Who can do it better?
Where do you see Pittsburgh's offense trying to exploit this Chargers defense, though, Dan? Is it George Pickens? Is it going to be dictating that run game? Obviously, I would believe that Mike Tomlin would look to, much like Jim Harbaugh, win the trench game and try to get that part of the offense going to make things easier for Justin Fields. But do you see an exploitation here for the Chargers defense? Again, I know we're talking about a very small sample size for the first 2 weeks of the season. Against Devontae Adams, they did a great job of really not allowing him to take over that game.
And Brock Bowers.
Carolina, we saw what this Chargers defense did, specifically the secondary. We talked about Christian Fulton in the game that he had. I would like to see that type of secondary plan continue overall for this unit. But where do you think that the Steelers are going to try to look to get some plays? Because even if you look at last week, Dan, you take away the final score, you look at the intricacies of that game, Justin Fields had one of the best throws that he ever had in his career to George Pickens, and it was negated by a penalty. George Pickens actually, if you take away the stat box, actually had a better game than what it was ended up finishing because of penalties that negated big-time plays. So how is this secondary going to focus on shutting him down? We know what the defensive line is going to try to do. You know you're going to try to get after Justin Fields. You know you're going to try to take away the run game. But on the times that you can't do that, where is it that you have to shut this team down?
It's interesting when you look at this Steelers offense. There's a lot of names that, Jake, you and I have gone through, draft talk in years past, and there are some guys that we loved on this team. Calvin Austin, if you know, you know. Darnell Washington on this team. Roman Wilson on this team. There's a lot of folks, Zach Frazier, a lot of folks looking for a center. A lot of folks on this team that Chargers fans, ourselves included, were big fans of. To me, this is a game in which I'm very curious how Derwin is deployed. Because you look at the Roman Wilsons, I think that George Pickens, I think that's negated. I'm not really worried about the outside, if I'm being honest. It seems like a Freiermuth. It seems like a slot receiver type game, and then just a bunch of rushes. And so I'm curious how Derwin and Dayon are utilized, because I think those are the ones that are going to be roaming and chasing, whether that's spying on Justin Fields, whether that's, securing the middle of the field. This might be the Derwin game that a lot of Chargers fans have been kind of waiting for. And you've heard Jesse Minter kind of allude to them deploying him differently depending on the matchups. I'm fascinated to see how he's utilized this week. And so he might be kind of my player to watch for this Chargers defense.
I would expect that as well. Before we get into that, Dan, because I know that this is going to be a pertinent topic, obviously with Justin Herbert practicing, which is great. And as you said, that everybody should fully expect him to play. I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's mind that he is going to play. But Dan, you talk about this injury report a little bit. Starting to stack up a little bit, much different than what it was a week or two ago. The latest injury report as it relates to players not practicing. Junior Colson, second straight day yesterday of not practicing. We'll see what happens later on today. Same with Bud Dupree, second straight day of not practicing. Then you had Josh Palmer, second straight day of not practicing. As it relates to intangibles, and much like you were talking about, is this the Dayon Henley situation where Pittsburgh is going to look to try to exploit that defensively? We know what Junior's been doing, but Denzel Perryman has been doing a great job thus far over the first 2 weeks of the season.
Huge.
It looks like you're going to possibly get a Lohi Gilman back, which would be nice for the secondary. He was limited in both days of practice this week. Jasir Taylor went from did not practice on Wednesday to a limited participant in practice yesterday, so that's trending at least in the right direction. Looks all good for Joey Bosa as well. So nothing too glaring other than the Junior Colson and Bud Dupree one. Defensively, do you still think, let's just play devil's advocate here, if neither one of those, I would actually like to see kind of a revenge game for Bud Dupree possibly here. But let's just play devil's advocate. If you are down both of those players, do you still think the Chargers have the horses to subplant, or do you deploy it differently?
Both of those being Junior Colson and Bud Dupree?
Yes.
Linebacking core, I'm not worried about. I think the linebackers have shown so far that group is up for the challenge. And again, shout out to Navarro Bowman. What that group is looking like year over year is insane to me. Defensive line, the edge group, I think that's something that we all talked about when we were looking at the 53-man roster. Is 4 edge players enough? And, you can add Morgan Fox into that if you want to kind of call him that. He's a little bit of a tweener. We'll see. There's layers to it too, because not only does it mean that the rotation is fewer if he doesn't go in Bud Dupree, but it also increases the chances of something not great happening to the other guys that are playing. And so instead of keeping guys fresh, keeping them in and out of snaps, more snaps in, definitely more opportunity for production, but also more opportunity for negative things to happen as well. And so could they bring somebody up from the practice squad? And I would think they probably do if Bud Dupree doesn't go, and then Jake gets his opportunity for his man to come out and show out. But yeah, generally speaking, though, I think they would be okay.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for leading the question in the direction that I wanted you to talk about. We thought that possibly last week when Joey Bosa wasn't practicing, that there could have been a chance that Tremont Morris-Brash was elevated from the practice squad last week. And then when we got the final injury report on Saturday of who was elevated, it looked like it was all systems go for Joey Bosa. So we'll obviously keep an eye on this as it relates to Bud Dupree for this week. Hell, if Tremont Morris-Brash gets an opportunity to go, I'm totally fine with it, because I love what he brings to the table in terms of how he gets after quarterbacks. So time will tell on that. Dan, let's talk about the coaching aspect of this, because there are just so many similarities here between Mike Tomlin and Jim Harbaugh. Again, 2 guys who just do not care how you get victories on Sundays. It doesn't matter if it's a 2-0 game with your team scoring the safety and winning it. It doesn't matter if it's in the ugliest fashion possible. At the end of the day, it still goes down as a W, and we'll correct those mistakes later. That is their philosophy. Dan, we talked about, I want to say that this was, I know I may have mentioned it last year at some point during the Chargers season in relation to Brandon Staley. I think it was actually possibly even 2 years ago that we really started this conversation. In the last 2 coaching regimes that the Chargers have had through Anthony Lynn or Brandon Staley, this Chargers team did not do well against those veteran head coaches. And now you have a veteran coach at your disposal and going up against one of the most respected coaches in the league, a coach who has not had a losing season since he has been the head coach.
Which is mind-blowing.
It's insane.
Especially when you look at the quarterbacks he's had. And everybody talks about how important that position is, which it is clearly important. Mike Tomlin de-gaffs.
Yes. So as much as we have spent time on this podcast over the years talking about the detriment that has not been, or that has been to the Chargers just in terms of coaching over the years, that X factor that has been missing, you feel so much more confident going into this game against the Steelers. If this was still previous regimes, this would have me a little bit uneasy.
This would be a predicted loss.
Yes.
Sure.
Going to Pittsburgh, going up against Mike Tomlin, this is probably going to be one of those situations where it's the unstoppable force versus the immovable object. Who's going to come better with a better game plan? Who's going to outcoach the other one? Who's going to have the better schemes and the execution? Thus far, from what we have seen from the Chargers, we have seen it just in terms of overall game plan, in terms of execution, in terms of ability to adapt. 3 things that have been missing from this team for so very long. We've seen that for the first 2 weeks. I love the fact that Jim Harbaugh is staying on the East Coast because in general, as far as we talked about the Chargers' strength of schedule, which is changing a little bit because before these games kicked off, I think they had the 26th highest strength of schedule, so it was one of the easiest schedules in the league. Now things have changed a little bit through the first 2 weeks of the season, but the Chargers were going to be the most traveled team throughout this season in terms of where they had to go, when they had their games against certain opponents. Now you're staying on the East Coast after a win in Carolina. Do you think they'll be acclimated, Dan? Do you think they'll be ready to go? It's a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I was going to say yes. The easy answer, yes. And it is refreshing to have that coaching confidence, if you will. And again, it's one of those I don't know what to do with my hands moments. And I think Chargers fans aren't really either. Because, again, historically, going up against the Steelers team, there have been a few games that the Chargers have squeaked out. I mean, remember when they were going after, I think it was the Justin Jackson game, and they were offside like 3 times on a field goal, by the way. But the Chargers barely squeaked that game out. That
game for Justin Herbert was fantastic for what he was able to do, not just through the air, but with his legs as well. Remember that long scamper that he ended up getting? And then it was Cam Hayward that ended. Cam Hayward, yes.
Yep. Yeah. I don't think this is that style of game. This is not going to be uppercut versus uppercut. This is body blows the entire way through, and can it punch through? When I was on a Pittsburgh Steelers station earlier this week, and they were asking for predictions, and I think I had a 2017 Chargers, and they were surprised with how high of scoring relative that was. And I kind of thought about it. I was like, you know what? They might be right. Maybe that's too high. Because 20 points against the Steelers defense seems tough. But so does 17 for the Chargers defense.
Yeah.
So let's get into kind of the bold predictions and final score predictions of this game. I said this is a Derwin game, so I'll go first. I would love to see Derwin get a pick 6. or a scoop and score. Some sort of touchdown by Derwin James. Because he's chomping at the bit, especially getting up for games like this. Like, this is the style of game that he loves. So I think this is the Derwin James game for me. I think he has a defensive score, and I'll go something like 9 tackles. Like, I think this is his style of game for sure. What about you? Bold prediction.
There's certain ways to look at a stat line like that for a safety. You could look at it on one end to say, like, oh my God, Derwin had a monster game. There's other sides to look at it, because remember back in the day when Eric Weddle was like the leading defensive tackler for the defense? Not so much the indicative type of stat that you want to see. It's not the best thing to look at.
And for the record, I have nine tackles, like mostly in the box tackles, not 9 tackles on the back end as your saving grace.
Right. Just wanted to give you an opportunity to specify that. Yeah. Dan, to me, this is going to be one on really which players on the Chargers offense are going to be able to make the big time plays. And yes, all the focus is going to be on this Chargers running game, on how it dictates the pace. And J.K. Dobbins hopefully going for a third straight rushing game.
And you're right, because you talked a little bit about Quentin, but for the most part, we're not really talking about receivers. But they're going to be out there.
That's where my bold prediction is going to go, Dan, because how is Pittsburgh going to just load the box with 8 the entire time to try to take away that run game and force Justin Herbert into a passing situation with these wide receivers? Most likely, yes.
I would.
Most likely, yes. So, to me, at certain points of the game, you're going to need to rely on Justin Herbert's arm if that running game is not getting you 4 to 5 yards a clip and putting you into third and short type of situations.
So, before you give it, though, do you see now, are you confident in Justin and the passing offense this week to improve upon what we've seen the last 2 weeks, I should say? Not that they're going to ball out, but like be more connected.
Well, this will be an interesting situation because I mentioned it a second ago, Joshua Palmer has not practiced this week. We'll see if he ends up playing. Could this be the game that Brandon Rice is ultimately elevated to?
That could be fun.
Whether it is or whether it isn't, it's still giving Justin Herbert a very unexperienced receiving core.
Fair.
That being said, Dan, I talked about where this Chargers offense can attack over the middle. I said it last week in my bold predictions. I want to lean towards it again, but I don't want to sound rinse and repeat. But if I'm following what Greg Roman has traditionally done against the Pittsburgh Steelers in terms of how he's utilized his offense, running game aside, I would love to see Hayden Hurst have a game. I would love to see that. I would love it to be an old school callback to what Greg Roman was able to do during the early years of Mark Andrews in Baltimore. I would like to see Hayden Hurst have himself a game. And I know I put it at last week against Carolina that I was hoping that he was going to get 58 yards and a touchdown. Unfortunately, that didn't end up happening. But something similar to that, I would like to bank on it again. I think the middle of this field is where you're going to be able to exploit. And I would hope from the standpoint in terms of how often the Chargers have their tight ends out on the field, whether it's in 2 tight end sets or whatever, I would hope that they're going to be able to get Hayden Hurst loose for a couple of those, that he can make some big chunk plays, ultimately find himself in the end zone.
All right, so Jake's going double or nothing. All right, Jake. Final scores. You go first.
You got me, Dan, because honestly, before you told me your prediction this week that you had said on the Pittsburgh show, I was thinking the exact same thing in terms of 20-17. It's in Pittsburgh. The Chargers have looked great in terms of pulling away second half of the games and, putting the game on ice, victory formations. I just don't see that this time. On the road against this caliber of coach, this caliber of defense, it's going to just be much harder to come by points in this game. It really is. So I'm going to go with 13-10 Old school Baltimore and Pittsburgh style of scoring. Yes, it's going to be a barn burner.
But who's got 13?
The Chargers have 13.
Optimistic Jake has entered the chat.
Did you see also how the betting line kind of shifted throughout the week? I think the Chargers were favored at one point by 1.5, and then everything kind of shifted to Pittsburgh by 2. I think they had it. I don't even know what the updating betting line is now, but I've seen that line jump all over the place.
I'm going to update mine. 2017. It seems unlikely that they can get 20. Given the state of the current Chargers offensive passing game, given the state of Justin Herbert, given the Pittsburgh defense, like all of those things included. I'll go 17-13 Chargers. And it's going to hurt. This is going to be a tough game. Chargers fans, like, brace yourself. Go on a walk ahead of the game. Go listen to some Enya. Go listen to the Calm app. Whatever you need to do. Go for a workout. Get everything out of your system.
Is this going to be the game where the fan base needs to have, like, the oxygen tanks ready and just breathe as we get closer to it?
Maybe, but I mean, kind of, but like in a different lens. I think in years past, we've had that oxygen because it's been just back and forth where Justin's had to sling it. And then you're hoping that the Chargers defense cannot royally screw something up, right? This is more, I think this is going to be a constant, right? This is going to be like death by 1,000 cuts sort of feel, where every series, it feels like you're just pulling teeth on both sides. And so I think brace for the inefficiencies, but that is because you're going up against a tall task. And so, like, expect that. And I think the Chargers team expects that. But I don't know that the Chargers fan base is expecting that and is prepared for that battle, right? Like that war zone mentality. But more specifically, for the Chargers to rise to that challenge. And I think that's what I'm looking forward to most, is seeing the Chargers attempt to, and maybe they can exceed, that level of intensity. Because we're not used to that. But 2 weeks in, we've seen it. And we've seen the Jim Harbaugh effect alive and well. Can that happen? And if they can do that against a Pittsburgh Steelers team and bring it to them, go 3-0, that week 4 game is coming up quick. SoFi is going to be rocking.
Before week 4, can the Chargers do something that they have not done in 22 years, and that is start off a season 3-0? We're going to find out on Sunday.
We are. Jake, it's been fun. We went a little long today, but for good reason. This Chargers-Steelers game is huge. You're seeing the Chargers kind of skyrocket up the charts in terms of rankings in the NFL, according to some folks. I think I saw them as high as like 6th or 7th. I'm like, who's doing these? This is amazing.
Was that Cowherd's rankings?
I think it
was. I think it was.
Probably. But look, this is going to be a fun one. Chargers fans, brace yourself. Jake, this has been great. Good luck with the rest of the house stuff. Hopefully things work out well. For Jake Hefner, you can find him at Jake D. Hefner, myself at Dan W. Sports. For Jake, I'm Dan. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.